So I don't know if you've heard this, but they're not making shortbread any longer. Luckily for us, we have a 250-year-old recipe, so we can make our own shortbread for the Scottish New Year. Today's recipe comes from 1779 from a Scottish cookbook called Cookery and Pastry, as taught and practiced by Mrs. McIver, teacher of those arts in Edinburgh. I chose this one because I love the word choice that Mrs. McIver uses. It's just charming. Take a peck of flour and 4 pounds of butter, English, or 3 pounds Scots weight. Put the butter on to come a boil, make a hole in the flour and pour the boiling butter in it. Work the flour and butter a little while together. Pour in a mutchkin of good yeast amongst the paste. Work it together, but not too much. Divide the paste and roll it out oval. Then cut through the middle and plait it at the ends. If you make it sweet, allow a pound of sugar to the peck of flour at least. If you want it very rich, put in citron, orange peel, and almonds. Strew white carvy on the top. Remember to prick it well on top. So when I first read it, I read it as munchkin of yeast. You need a munchkin of yeast. What is that? It's actually a mutchkin of yeast, which was a Scottish unit of volume in the 17th and 18th century that's equal to about 425 milliliters. We won't need near that much because I am cutting this recipe way back. The other word that threw me was carvy. You strew white carvy on top if you want it rich. I couldn't figure out what that was until I said it in my bad Scottish brogue. So you strew carvy. Carvy is caraway, and I actually confirmed that with some old Scottish dictionaries. It is caraway, and they used caraway sometimes on Scottish shortbread at this time. Cookies and baked shortbread with carvy nicely done, and oatmeal cakes. Now what really makes this recipe stand out from modern shortbread is the addition of yeast, so I'm really curious what that's going to do to the texture. Also, in modern shortbread, there's pretty much always sugar, and in her base recipe, she does not include sugar. It's an option if you want to make it sweet. She also gives the option to add the almonds and the candied citron and candied peel, as well as the caraway seeds. I'm not going to add those because I'm curious about the texture compared to modern shortbread, and I don't want anything to interfere with that. But I am going to be adding sugar. Now shortbread, no matter how you make it, can tend to be rather dry, and so it's very often eaten with either a cup of tea, or in my case, a cup of coffee. All you'll need for this recipe is 4 cups or 480 grams of flour, 2.5 cups or 285 grams of melted butter, 1/4 cup or 50 grams of sugar, and a yeast mixture made with 2 teaspoons of dried yeast mixed into a 1/4 cup of water with a tablespoon of flour added in. Mix it up and then just let it sit for about 30 minutes. At that point, if it's nice and frothy, then you can start boiling your butter on the stove. Now you want it boiling, but you don't want it to burn, so keep it moving around the pot as you cook it. Then pour it into a bowl with the flour and mix it into a dough. Also, if you are going to use almonds or candied peel, add it to the flour before you add the butter. Also, so you don't burn your hands, don't use your hands for this first mixing. Go ahead and use a spatula or a spoon. Once everything is incorporated and the dough has cooled down so that it's warm but not scalding, add in the yeast mixture. Then mix it a bit, then add in the sugar and work the dough for another 2 to 3 minutes or until it's nice and smooth. And then you can shape the dough. Now, the thing is, I could not make heads or tails of what she is trying to describe in this recipe. She says to roll it out, the pieces out into ovals, and then to cut through the middle and plait at the ends. I cannot picture this process, and I went through quite a bit of dough trying to figure out what she meant. I made cuts every which way, I tried plaiting it every way, and I don't know how you plait dough that isn't in strands, and I don't know how she gets strands from what she's describing. If someone knows what she means, please, I would love to know. I got very, very frustrated trying to shape this dough, and so I ended up just doing ovals. Whatever you do though, make sure to prick or dock the dough before sliding it into the oven at 325 degrees Fahrenheit or 165 Celsius for about 35 minutes. And while that bakes, let us ponder what makes shortbread shortbread. Shortbread. Peculiar name. Not the short part. The short part means it is short, which is the crispy kind of crumbly texture, and that comes from the heavy addition of a lot of shortening, in this case, butter. Today when we say shortening, we usually mean like Crisco or vegetable shortening, but shortening is any fat that is a solid at room temperature. Lard, butter, tallow, all the good stuff. Shortbread likely started out in the Middle Ages as leftover bread that was baked at a low temperature for a long time to dry it out, extending its shelf life. Now, over time, this rock-hard bread changed into something that was more palatable, and nobody really knows when that happened. It's possible that it took place during the Old Alliance, which started in 1295 as a pact between the kingdoms of Scotland and France against England under the reign of Edward Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots. Anyway, Scotland and France hated England, and for about 300 years, they teamed up. And sometime during this period, butter was introduced to this hard bread. Which completely makes sense, because anytime a lot of butter is added to a dish, there's usually some Frenchman behind it. God bless him. Now, this change in the recipe made it so shortbread was really no longer bread, but it's said that the bakers of Scotland refused to change the name because the sale of bread was taxed lower than that of biscuits and other confections. If that's true, then in essence, the name shortbread is just a way to evade some taxes. Now, this tax-dodging biscuit was probably eaten throughout the Middle Ages by many people, but it never really made it into the history books, not until the 16th century when it found a celebrity to give it an endorsement. And in Scotland at the time, there was no greater celebrity than Mary, Queen of Scots, the Beyoncé of the House of Stuart. Tradition says that during her reign, Mary was an avid eater of shortbread, specifically petticoat tails. That's when shortbread is baked in a large circle and then cut as one would cut a pizza. They're often made in molds like this one so that you get a wonderful embossed design on the petticoat tails. And nobody really knows from where the term petticoat tails came in relation to shortbread. Some people say that it was a corruption of the Old French petite gastelle, meaning little cake, but it could have also simply been that they resembled women's petticoats, especially the ones worn around the Elizabethan era. Whatever the reason, this was and still is today one of the traditional ways of shaping shortbread. The other ways are either in a tray bake, you kind of bake the whole thing and then while it's still hot you cut it into fingers, or just in round cookies. None of those ways are what Mrs. McIver is trying to describe in her recipe, at least I don't think so. So with a pedigree that includes Mary Queen of Scots, there's no denying that shortbread is as Scottish as Sean Connery in a kilt. In fact, the 19th century Scottish historian Thomas Henderson called shortbread the triumph of Scottish baking on the old national lines. But why its association with this particular time of year? I mean, you can eat shortbread at any time of year, but traditionally it was served at weddings and at Yuletide. Now, one reason was probably because with the amount of butter that was in it, it was a rather expensive treat and so saved for special occasions. But when it comes to Yule, the custom is thought to have descended from the eating of the Yule bannock in pagan days. The bannock was a flat, unleavened cake in a round shape that often had the ends kind of twisted going around it so that it resembled the sun, perfect for the solstice. And some early descriptions of shortbread include this shape. And this sun-shaped shortbread would be enjoyed throughout the season, but especially on Hogmanay, or the Scottish New Year. One tradition that has been associated with Hogmanay since time immemorial is first footers, or those who go visiting from house to house in the wee sma' hours of New Year morning. Often it was simply whoever first showed up to the house, usually a friend or a family member. But at different times and different places in Scotland, there were specific people who went from house to house to house, almost as some sort of like New Year's duty. And I'm really hoping that this is not the case any longer, but as recently as 100 years ago, in parts of Scotland and on the Isle of Man, it was considered good luck if the person who came to your door had dark hair and a dark complexion. And it was unlucky if that person had blonde or red hair. And many folklorists think that superstition dates back all the way to the time of the Vikings, because at that point, if someone showed up to your doorstep with blonde or red hair, they usually had an axe in their hand. Anyway, these first footers often came with a gift, either some shortbread or a black bun, and that sometimes it could be salt or a piece of coal or a glass of whiskey. I know which one I would prefer. And the great Robert Louis Stevenson, while writing about the lead-up to Hogmanay in 19th century Edinburgh, wrote, "For weeks before the great morning confectioners display stacks of Scotch black bun, a dense black substance inimical to life, and full moons of shortbread adorned with mots of peel or sugar plum in honor of the season and the family affections." For today, it is the full moons of shortbread for us. So you'll know your shortbread is ready when the edges just start to brown. Then take them out of the oven and let them cool completely. And here we are, 18th century Scottish shortbread. So I feel like they do puff up a little bit more than modern shortbread. So it's definitely short. I mean, it really crumbles. So the texture is already quite similar just by the look of it to modern shortbread. Maybe a little bit different, I think, because of the melted butter. Let's give it a shot. The texture is actually quite different. It's not as sweet because there's probably not as much sugar as they use today, but what's really different is the texture. At first it feels the same, but it literally just dissolves in your mouth, which at first is kind of cool, and then it turns into like paste, and it's really hard to eat. It's good, but you can't, you have to have something to drink with these. It's like eating glue. In a good way, as long as you have something to wash the glue down with. I mean, the flavor is very nice though, so I could probably eat these.